Mother's Day is supposed to be simple. A call, a message, maybe flowers if you remember early enough. At the very least, some kind of acknowledgement that the woman who gave you life still matters. That's what I believed anyway. I woke up that morning with my phone beside me, fully charged, volume turned up, already smiling before a single notification came in. I told myself not to expect much. I really did. But deep down, I still hoped. Hours passed. Morning turned into afternoon. Afternoon slowly slid into evening. And my phone stayed silent. No call. No text. No Happy Mother's Day. Nothing. At first, I tried to brush it off. People get busy. Life happens. Maybe they were planning a surprise. Maybe they'd call later. I kept making excuses for them, because that's what mothers do. We protect our children, even when they're not around to hear it. I went about my day pretending it didn't hurt, cooking for myself, cleaning the house, doing the same routines I'd done for years. But every time my phone buzzed with a random notification, my heart jumped for just a second. And every time it wasn't them. By nightfall, the truth settled in. They hadn't forgotten accidentally. They had skipped Mother's Day on purpose. Or worse, they hadn't even thought about it. That realization stung in a way I wasn't prepared for. I sat on the edge of my bed, phone in hand, scrolling through old photos. Birthdays, holidays, school events, all the moments I showed up. All the times I put them first, even when it cost me sleep, money, or my own happiness. I told myself I wasn't keeping score. But that night, the silence made everything loud. I didn't confront them. I didn't send a passive-aggressive message. I didn't post anything online. I stayed quiet. I let the day end the way it had begun, unacknowledged. Somewhere deep inside, something shifted. Not anger. Not yet. Just clarity. A quiet, painful clarity that changed how I saw things. I went to bed telling myself tomorrow would be just another day, even though I knew it wouldn't be. A few days later, my phone rang. I recognized the number immediately. My heart reacted before my mind did, that old instinct kicking in. I answered, trying to sound normal, trying not to let the hurt slip into my voice. They didn't start with an apology. They didn't mention Mother's Day. No, how are you? No, sorry we missed your day. They jumped straight into what they needed. Money. They said it casually like it was no big deal. Like skipping Mother's Day was nothing, but asking me for help was perfectly normal. As they talked, I listened quietly. I let them explain their situation, their reasons, their urgency. I'd heard versions of this before. Different details, same outcome. They needed me to fix things again. To step in. To cover the gap. I could feel something building in my chest, a mix of disbelief and resolve. The timing alone was shocking. Not a single word for Mother's Day, but plenty of words when money was involved. That contrast hit me harder than the silence ever did. I didn't interrupt them. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. Asked a few calm questions, the kind that made it seem like I was considering their request. Inside, though, my thoughts were racing. I thought about every sacrifice I'd made over the years. Every time I put my own needs last. Every moment I convinced myself that love meant giving endlessly, even when it hurt. I realized that this phone call wasn't just about money. It was about respect. It was about boundaries. It was about whether I would keep teaching them that I'd always be there no matter how they treated me. When they finally paused, waiting for my answer, there was a long silence. The kind that makes people uncomfortable. The kind that forces reflection whether they want it or not. I took a deep breath. My voice was steady when I spoke, but my words carried a weight they weren't expecting. I didn't give them the answer they assumed was coming. I didn't react the way I always had before. And in that moment, I could almost hear the shift on the other end of the line. They were shocked, confused, maybe even a little scared. They asked if I was serious, if something was wrong, if I was upset about something. That was the moment they finally noticed. Not the missed holiday, not the ignored messages, but the change in me. And as they started to realize that this time was different, I knew there was no going back to how things used to be. What happened next wasn't loud or dramatic. There was no screaming match. No slammed phones. Just a calm decision that changed everything. A decision that forced them to see me not just as a source of support, but as a person with feelings, limits, and self-respect. They had asked for money expecting a familiar outcome. What they got instead was the shock of their lives. And as I hung up the phone, sitting alone in the quiet house, I wondered if they truly understood what they'd lost that Mother's Day. Or if it would take something even bigger for the message to finally sink in. That's where the real story begins. After I ended the call, the house felt quieter than usual. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind that presses against your ears and makes you replay everything in your head. I sat there for a long time, staring at the dark screen of my phone, half expecting it to light up again. It didn't. That silence felt different now. Heavier. Like something important had just happened, even though nothing on the surface looked changed. I started thinking about how we got here. It hadn't always been like this. There was a time when they called just to talk. When they shared small details about their day, silly problems, random thoughts. Back then, I felt needed in a warm way, not a transactional one. Somewhere along the line, those calls slowly disappeared, replaced by messages that always had urgency attached to them. A bill that needed paying. A problem that needed fixing. A favor that couldn't wait. And without even realizing it, I stepped into that role fully, believing that being a good mother meant always saying yes. I remembered the first time I lent them money. They promised it was temporary. Just until things got better. I didn't hesitate. I told myself this was what parents do. You help your children stand when they stumble. But one favor turned into another. And another. Over time, the promises got shorter, the explanations thinner. I noticed they stopped explaining unless I asked. It was as if my help had become expected, not appreciated. Still, I kept giving. I ignored the small voice inside me that whispered something wasn't right. I didn't want to be the kind of mother who kept score. I didn't want resentment to grow. I told myself love meant patience, understanding, and sacrifice. But no one tells you how heavy those sacrifices can become when they're one-sided. That Miss Mother's Day brought all of that to the surface. It wasn't just about a holiday. It was about effort, about being seen, about feeling like I mattered beyond what I could provide. When they skipped that day so easily, it felt like confirmation of something I had been avoiding for a long time. That realization stayed with me as the days passed. They didn't call back right away after that conversation. No follow-up, no apology, no explanation. That absence spoke louder than any argument could have. I found myself checking my phone less, not because I didn't care, but because I was tired of hoping. Each hour that passed without a message added another layer to the tension, another unanswered question hanging in the air. Friends noticed the change in me before I said anything. They asked if I was okay. I told them I was fine because explaining felt too complicated. How do you explain loving your children deeply while feeling taken for granted at the same time? How do you admit that the people you've given everything to might not even notice when you stop giving? At night, sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept circling back to that phone call. Their tone, their surprise, the way they hesitated when I didn't immediately agree. I wondered what they were saying about me on their end. Were they confused? Angry? Embarrassed? Or were they already moving on to someone else who could help them instead? I also questioned myself. Had I been too harsh? Too sudden? Should I have explained more? Those doubts crept in quietly, trying to pull me back into old habits. But every time I felt myself soften, I remembered that empty Mother's Day. I remembered waiting all day for a call that never came. And that memory grounded me. Days turned into a week. Still nothing. No acknowledgement of what happened. No attempt to fix things. That lack of communication created its own kind of mystery. I didn't know if they were giving me space, punishing me with silence, or simply assuming I'd come around eventually. The uncertainty was exhausting. Then, out of nowhere, a message appeared. Short, careful, almost polite. It didn't mention money. It didn't mention Mother's Day either. It was as if they were testing the water, trying to see where they stood without fully stepping in. I read it several times, noticing what wasn't said just as much as what was. I didn't reply right away. Not out of spite, but because I wanted to respond thoughtfully. For once, I wasn't rushing to smooth things over. I was paying attention to my own feelings. And that alone felt unfamiliar. Empowering, but also scary. When you change a pattern that's been in place for years, everything feels unstable for a while. As I waited, memories kept surfacing. Late nights, worrying about them. Skipping things I wanted so I could afford things they needed. Defending them when others questioned their choices. I realized how much of my identity had been wrapped up in being the one who always showed up. And now, by stepping back even slightly, I felt like I was standing on unfamiliar ground. That message stayed unanswered longer than they probably expected. And in that space, the tension continued to build. Because this wasn't just about a single request for money anymore. It was about what our relationship would look like moving forward. Whether they would see me differently. Whether I would finally be seen at all. I could sense that something was coming. Another call. Another conversation. Another moment that would force everything into the open. But for now, everything remained unresolved, hanging in the balance. And I knew, deep down, that the next move, whether it came from them or from me, would change things in a way none of us were fully prepared for. The next call came late in the evening, the kind of time when worries feel bigger and defenses are lower. I stared at the screen as it rang, my heart beating faster than I wanted to admit. Part of me wanted to let it go to voicemail, just to see what they would say when they couldn't hear my voice. Another part of me knew avoiding the conversation would only stretch the tension thinner, not ease it. I answered, steady but cautious. This time, the tone was different. Softer. Slower. They asked how I was doing like it was a detail they suddenly remembered mattered. I answered honestly, but briefly. I wasn't ready to open everything up. Not yet. They filled the silence with small talk, things that felt carefully chosen, almost rehearsed. It felt like walking across thin ice, every word measured, every pause loaded with meaning. Then the conversation turned, not directly to money, but close enough that it hovered there unspoken. They talked about stress, bills, uncertainty. They didn't ask outright, but I could hear the expectation underneath it all. It was strange how familiar it felt, even though everything had changed. I realized this was one of the ways the pattern had survived for so long. They didn't always need to ask. I used to offer. This time I didn't. That pause seemed to throw them off. They stumbled slightly, filling the gap with explanations that sounded more like justifications. I listened, really listened, and noticed how little space there was for me in their story. Their problems took up all the room. My feelings barely existed in it. That realization hurt, but it also brought clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a habit we had both helped create. Later that night, after the call ended without resolution, I thought about their perspective. Maybe they didn't see things the way I did. Maybe they truly believed everything was fine because I had never said otherwise. I had always been strong, reliable, available. I had taught them that silence meant consent, that patience meant endless supply. That thought was uncomfortable because it meant I wasn't just reacting to their behavior. I was confronting my own role in it. The days that followed felt heavy. Family members reached out, unaware of the quiet storm brewing underneath polite conversations. Everyone assumed things were normal. I smiled, nodded, changed the subject. I wasn't ready to share what was happening. It felt too raw, too unfinished. And in a way, keeping it to myself made the tension grow louder inside me. I noticed changes in myself, too. I hesitated before answering messages. I took time before responding to requests, even small ones. That pause felt powerful and terrifying at the same time. I worried they would see it as distance, as rejection. But I also knew that rushing back into old patterns would erase everything I had started to stand for. On their side, the messages became more frequent, but less direct. Check-ins that didn't quite check in. Conversations that circled the real issue, without naming it. It was like we were both waiting for the other to blink first. Each interaction added another layer to the conflict, another chance for things to either heal or break further apart. One day, I overheard through a mutual connection that they were frustrated, that they didn't understand why I was acting different. That word stayed with me. Different. Not distant. Not hurt. Just different. It made me wonder if they even realized the weight of what had happened. Or if, to them, this was just an inconvenience, a disruption to something they assumed would always stay the same. That night, I pulled out old letters and cards they had given me years ago. Handmade notes, scribbled messages full of affection. Proof that there was once a deeper connection there. I didn't look at them to make myself sad. I looked at them to remind myself that this relationship had value beyond money, beyond favors. Or at least it used to. I started asking myself harder questions. What did I want moving forward? Respect, yes. Appreciation, definitely. But also honesty. I didn't want forced gestures or guilt-driven apologies. I wanted them to understand why skipping Mother's Day mattered. Why asking for money right after felt like a slap instead of a request. I wanted acknowledgement, not excuses. Another message came in, longer this time. It hinted at disappointment, at confusion, at feeling unsupported. I read it slowly, feeling the familiar tug of guilt trying to pull me back. That old instinct to fix everything flared up again. But underneath it, there was something new. A quiet strength that reminded me why I had paused in the first place. I realized this conflict wasn't just about one holiday or one phone call. It was about years of unspoken expectations finally colliding with reality. It was about a mother learning to set boundaries and children learning what happens when those boundaries appear for the first time. Neither side knew exactly how to handle it, and that uncertainty kept everything tense. As I put my phone down, unanswered message still glowing on the screen, I knew the next conversation would be harder than the last. Something would have to be said that couldn't be taken back. And whether it led to understanding or further distance was still unclear. All I knew was that the silence between us was growing louder, and it was only a matter of time before it demanded to be heard. The tension reached a point where it felt impossible to ignore. Every message, every missed call, every pause between replies carried more weight than the words themselves. I could feel something coming, like the air changing before a storm. They were growing impatient, and I was growing firmer, even if I didn't say much out loud. It was the kind of standoff where both sides pretend everything is fine, but nothing actually is. One afternoon, I received a call I hadn't expected. Not from them directly, but from someone close to them. The conversation was careful, polite, but layered with concern. They asked how things were going between us, in a way that suggested they already knew there was a problem. I chose my words slowly, not wanting to turn it into gossip, but also not willing to pretend anymore. That call made it clear the situation had spilled beyond our private conversations. Others were noticing the distance now. That realization added another layer to the conflict. It wasn't just between us anymore. Perceptions were forming. Stories were being told, possibly without my voice included. I wondered what version of events was being shared. Was I the mother who suddenly changed? The one who refused to help when needed? Or was there at least some acknowledgement that something deeper had caused this shift? Later that evening, they finally called again. This time, there was no small talk. No easing into the conversation. The tone was tense, defensive, edged with frustration. They asked directly why I was making things difficult. That phrase hit hard. Making things difficult. As if asking for basic respect was an inconvenience. As if my feelings were obstacles instead of realities. I felt my chest tighten, but I kept my voice calm. I told them this wasn't about making things hard. It was about being hurt. That word hung between us, heavy and unfamiliar. There was a pause on the other end, longer than usual. I could almost hear them processing it, deciding how to respond. They pushed back. They said they didn't mean to hurt me. That they didn't think skipping Mother's Day was a big deal. That life had been stressful. That they assumed I understood. Each explanation landed like a reminder of the gap between us. To them, it was oversight. To me, it was a pattern. As the conversation deepened, emotions rose on both sides. Old grievances surfaced, things neither of us had ever said out loud before. They mentioned pressure, expectations, feeling like they were always falling short. I mentioned feeling invisible, taken for granted, and only remembered when something was needed. The words came slowly but firmly, Years of silence finally finding a voice. At one point, the conversation circled back to money again. Not directly asking, but framing it as part of the strain they were under. That was when I realized how close we were to the breaking point. This wasn't just about feelings anymore. It was about whether anything had truly changed. Whether they still believed support was guaranteed, regardless of how they showed up. My heart pounded as I chose my next words carefully. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I said I needed time. Time to think. Time to decide what was healthy for me. That answer didn't sit well with them. I could hear it in the way their voice tightened, in the shortness of their responses. Waiting was not something they were used to doing when it came to me. After the call ended, I felt drained but strangely grounded. I knew I had stepped into unfamiliar territory, and there was no clear path forward. I replayed the conversation again and again, wondering if I'd said too much or not enough. The truth was, once certain things are spoken, they can't be unheard. The days that followed were tense and quiet. Messages came in bursts, sometimes emotional, sometimes distant. One moment they seemed understanding, the next resentful. It felt like they were wrestling with the idea that things might not go back to how they were. And I was wrestling with the fear of what standing my ground might cost me. I found myself thinking about the future more than ever, about what kind of relationship I wanted with them and what kind of example I was setting by finally saying no, or at least not immediately saying yes. I knew this moment would define what came next, whether boundaries could exist without breaking bonds, or whether the bond had been relying on the absence of boundaries all along. Then came the message that changed the energy completely. It wasn't long, but it was direct. It asked for a final answer, not just about money, but about where we stood. The weight of it pressed into my chest as I read it. This was it, the moment everything had been building toward. Whatever I said next would push things in one direction or another, and there would be no pretending otherwise. I set my phone down, hands trembling slightly, and took a deep breath. Outside, the world went on like normal. Cars passed. Birds chirped. The contrast felt surreal. Inside, everything was on edge. Years of love, sacrifice, misunderstanding, and unmet expectations all came down to this unanswered message. I knew the next response would either force a reckoning or deepen the divide. And as I sat there, caught between what I'd always been and who I was becoming, the tension reached its peak. The resolution was close now, so close I could almost feel it, but not yet. Not until I decided what mattered most. I was still sitting there, staring at that message, when another notification appeared. This one wasn't from them. It was from my bank. A routine alert at first glance, but when I opened it, my stomach dropped. There had been an attempt to access my account. It didn't go through, but the timing felt too close to be a coincidence. My heart started racing as questions flooded my mind. Was it a mistake? A system error? Or something much more unsettling? I tried to calm myself, telling myself not to jump to conclusions. Still, I couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that settled in my chest. I thought back to all the times I had shared financial details casually, never imagining I'd need to guard them. Trust had always been assumed. Now, that trust felt fragile, almost cracked. The escalation was no longer just emotional. It felt personal in a way I hadn't anticipated. Before I could fully process that, my phone rang again. This time it was them. I hesitated before answering, my thoughts racing. When I finally picked up, their voice was sharper than before, edged with urgency. They said they needed to talk immediately. Not later. Not after I thought things through. Right now. That urgency made my pulse quicken. It felt like pressure, like a push to force a decision before I was ready. They started talking fast, words tumbling over each other. They said things were worse than they'd let on, that they were running out of options, that they felt abandoned. Each sentence seemed designed to pull at my emotions, to remind me of my role, of the responsibility I'd carried for so long. But now, layered beneath that, there was something else. A tension I hadn't heard before. I asked a simple question. One I hadn't planned but felt necessary. Had they tried to access my account? The line went silent. Not the kind of pause where someone is thinking of what to say, but the kind where everything stops. That silence stretched long enough for my heart to pound in my ears. When they finally spoke, their answer wasn't clear. Not a yes. Not a no. Just confusion mixed with defensiveness. That response shifted everything. The conflict was no longer just about money requests or skipped holidays. It was about boundaries being crossed in ways I never imagined I'd have to defend against my own children. I felt a mix of disbelief and sadness, emotions colliding in my chest. I wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation, but the doubt had already taken root. They accused me of overreacting, of reading too much into things, of letting one missed Mother's Day change how I saw them. Hearing that stung more than I expected. It reduced everything I was feeling into something small and unreasonable. But deep down, I knew this wasn't about one day. It was about years of imbalance finally demanding attention. As the conversation grew more heated, I noticed how quickly it shifted back to urgency, back to need, back to how critical my help was. It felt like whiplash, going from emotional defense to practical demand in seconds. That back and forth only heightened the stakes. I realized they weren't just asking for support anymore. They were afraid of losing access to it. When the call ended abruptly, I sat in stunned silence. My hands were shaking now, not just from emotion, but from the weight of what this moment represented. I checked my account again, changed my passwords, took steps I never thought I'd need to take. Each action felt like a quiet admission that something fundamental had shifted between us. Then another message came through, this one longer, more emotional than the last. It mixed apologies with pressure, understanding with blame. It promised things would be different, while still asking for an answer. Reading it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure whether stepping forward would lead to solid ground or a fall. The second plot twist changed the entire shape of the conflict. This was no longer just a story about a mother being taken for granted. It was about trust, control, and the painful realization that love alone doesn't protect you from being hurt. The stakes were higher now. Whatever decision I made next wouldn't just define our relationship. It would define how I protected myself moving forward. I set the phone down again, my mind spinning. Somewhere between the missed Mother's Day, the request for money, and this sudden breach of trust, the line had been crossed. I didn't know yet how I would respond. But I knew one thing for certain. The next step would change everything, and there would be no turning back once it was taken. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I slept on it, though sleep is a generous word for what actually happened. My mind kept replaying every conversation, every warning sign I had ignored over the years. By morning, the fear had settled into something clearer. Resolve. I realized that whatever happened next, I couldn't keep avoiding it. The waiting was doing more damage than the truth ever could. I asked them to meet in person. Not to argue. Not to negotiate. Just to talk. They hesitated at first, then agreed, which surprised me. When the day came, I felt oddly calm, like I had already accepted whatever outcome was coming. We sat across from each other, and for the first time in a long while, there was nowhere to hide behind screens or carefully worded messages. I started by talking about Mother's Day. Not angrily, not dramatically. Just honestly. I told them how it felt to wait all day for a call that never came. How that silence hurt more than they realized. They looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seat, clearly not expecting me to begin there. One of them tried to brush it off again, saying they didn't think it mattered that much. That was when I finally said what I'd been holding back for years. I told them it mattered because it showed effort. Because it showed awareness. Because it showed that I existed in their lives beyond what I could give. I explained how every request for money, especially right after that day, made me feel less like a mother and more like a resource. The room grew quiet. No interruptions. No excuses. Just listening. Then we talked about the money directly. I told them clearly that I wouldn't be giving them any more financial help. Not now. Not later. I explained that it wasn't punishment, but a boundary. That I needed to protect myself, my peace, and my future. Their reaction was immediate. Shock. Anger. Fear. All the emotions surfaced at once. They said they felt abandoned, that they didn't know how they'd manage without my help. I acknowledged their fear, but I didn't back down. I told them I believed they were capable, even if they didn't believe it themselves yet. That part hurt them, I could tell. Sometimes belief feels like pressure when you're used to being rescued. Then I addressed the bank alert. The air shifted instantly. Their faces changed. One of them admitted they had tried to check my account, claiming it was only to see if there was anything there because they were desperate. Hearing it out loud felt like a punch to the chest. It wasn't malicious, they said. Just panic. But panic doesn't erase broken trust. That was the moment everything broke open. Apologies followed. Real ones this time. Not rushed. Not defensive. They admitted they had taken my support for granted, that they assumed I'd always be there to catch them, no matter what. And for the first time, I could see the weight of that realization settling in. I told them I loved them. That hadn't changed. But love didn't mean unlimited access anymore. It meant honesty, respect, and boundaries. I said our relationship could continue, but it had to be different. No more financial dependence. No more emotional guilt. If they wanted me in their lives, it had to be as a mother, not a backup plan. They didn't leave happy. They left quiet, thoughtful, maybe even shaken. But something had shifted. The main conflict was finally out in the open, and for the first time, it wasn't wrapped in silence or assumptions. Weeks passed. The tension slowly eased. They reached out more genuinely. Short messages at first, then longer ones. No requests, just updates, conversations. And then something unexpected happened. They showed up one afternoon without asking for anything. No emergency, no problem to solve. Just to sit and talk. As they were leaving, one of them handed me a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. It wasn't long, just a simple apology for Mother's Day. For not seeing me, for not saying thank you sooner. And tucked behind the note was something else. A receipt. Proof that they had started paying back old debts on their own, without telling me. That should have been the end of the story. The satisfying resolution. But life rarely wraps things up that neatly. A few days later, I received a call from the bank again. This time, it wasn't an alert. It was confirmation. They informed me that a savings account I had forgotten about years ago, one I had opened in their names when they were much younger, had been accessed. Not improperly. Legally. They had found it on their own. They hadn't taken the money. Instead, they had added to it. When I confronted them, confused and emotional, they told me they had discovered it while sorting through old documents. They said they realized how much I had always planned ahead for them, even when they weren't paying attention. And this time, they wanted to do something different. Not ask, not take, but give back in their own way. The twist wasn't dramatic. No shouting. No big reveal. Just a quiet reversal of roles that left me speechless. The same children who once skipped Mother's Day and only called when they needed money were now trying, awkwardly but sincerely, to show appreciation. The conflict was resolved, but the story didn't end with perfection. Trust would take time. Boundaries would need to stay firm. But as I held that note again, I realized the real shock wasn't denying the money. The real shock was finally choosing myself and watching everything change because of it. After that call with the bank, I sat quietly for a long time, letting everything sink in. The anger, the hurt, the fear, all of it slowly softened into something steadier. Not relief exactly, but understanding. For the first time in a long while, I felt like the story wasn't controlling me anymore. I was finally standing inside it, aware of every choice that had led us here. I met with them again a few days later. This time, there was no tension in the room. No guarded tones or carefully chosen words. Just honesty. They explained how uncomfortable it felt to realize how much they had leaned on me without thinking about the cost. They admitted they had confused love with availability and support with obligation. Hearing that didn't erase the past, but it did give it context. I answered the questions I had been holding on to. I told them why I hadn't spoken up sooner. How I believed being a good mother meant absorbing discomfort quietly. How I thought speaking up would make me seem demanding or selfish. Saying it out loud made me realize how many mothers carry that same belief without realizing how heavy it becomes over time. They asked if things could ever feel normal again. I told them yes, but not the old normal. Something better. Something healthier. A relationship built on respect instead of expectation. On communication instead of silence. It wasn't a perfect conversation, but it was real, and that mattered more. Over the following months, small changes added up. Calls came without requests attached. Mother's Day came around again, and this time, it didn't pass quietly. It wasn't about gifts or grand gestures. It was about presence. A call early in the morning. A visit later that day. A genuine effort that felt earned, not forced. The money issue didn't disappear overnight, but it changed shape. They worked through their struggles on their own, sometimes sharing updates, sometimes asking for advice instead of help. And when they stumbled, they didn't expect me to catch them. They figured out how to stand back up themselves. Watching that wasn't easy, but it was necessary. As for me, I changed too. I stopped measuring my worth by how much I gave. I learned that boundaries aren't punishments, they're protection. I realized that saying no doesn't erase love. Sometimes it strengthens it. Those lessons didn't come all at once. They came slowly, through moments of doubt, guilt, and reflection. Friends noticed the difference in me. I was lighter, more grounded. I spoke more honestly about my feelings. I didn't rush to fix things that weren't mine to fix. And in doing that, I discovered a version of myself I hadn't known in years. One who still loved deeply, but didn't disappear in the process. The forgotten savings account became a quiet symbol between us. Not because of the money in it, but because of what it represented. A full circle moment. Years ago, I had opened it out of love and hope. Now they were adding to it out of understanding and gratitude. No announcements. No expectations. Just action. We never pretended the past didn't happen. We acknowledged it, learned from it, and moved forward with clearer eyes. There were still awkward moments, still growing pains. But the foundation was different now. Stronger. More balanced. Looking back, I realized the real turning point wasn't when they skipped Mother's Day, or even when they asked me for money. It was when I finally listened to the quiet voice inside me that said, "This hurts." When I stopped ignoring that voice, everything else followed. This story isn't just about family conflict or financial boundaries. It's about self-respect, about recognizing when love needs limits to survive. It's about understanding that being kind doesn't mean being endlessly available, and being a parent doesn't mean being invisible. If there's one takeaway I hold on to, it's this: the hardest conversations often lead to the most meaningful change. Silence feels safer, but honesty builds something real. And sometimes, the biggest shock isn't what happens when you say no, it's what finally happens when you do. In the end, we didn't lose each other. We found a better way to show up. And that, more than anything, made the journey worth it.